Hello, I'm Ute Burkhardt.
And I'm Ed Fritsch.
And we are the co-founders of ACIR and UCIR. And with us here today is Dr. Patrick Ott. He's an oncologist and the clinical director of the Melanoma Disease Center and the Center for Immuno-Oncology at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston. We are very happy to have you here today. Welcome, Patrick.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
So last week we had this very exciting opportunity to, as part of the Cancer Immunotherapy Month, to share a free screening of the documentary Jim Allison Breakthrough with our audience. And many of you have watched the documentary with us, and a bunch of questions have come up. And Dr. Ott is here today with us to help us answer these questions.
So great. So Patrick, can you sort of give us a little background of yourself before we get started?
So I have a background in immunology. I actually did my medical school in Germany and then came for a postdoc in a lab where I worked on autoimmune problems, and then did my residency in the United States, and then came for an oncology fellowship to NYU, where I continued to do immunology, but then went to cancer. Worked with Nina Bardwaj there at NYU on the grid cell projects. And then about 10 years ago, I was hired to Dana-Farber, where I really started to work more broadly on immunotherapy, phase 1 trials, and also met Ed Fritsch at that time, and we have been working on personalized cancer vaccines together since as well. Mm-hmm. And my clinical interest is actually really a focus on melanoma.
Good.
Okay. What did you think about the movie?
So I'd say, so I'd never seen it, and I've obviously heard before, and then just watched it like last week when it came out. So it was a great opportunity to see it. I thought it was very personal. It was very, mainly, obviously, as it was meant to be a biography. I would say I was, in part, I was actually honored because I realized that I essentially knew everyone who was portrayed in the movie, either personally or I at least interacted with them in some kind of fashion at a meeting or through conferences, and so that was I'd say rewarding to me, that I felt like, well, I'd really been to some extent part of this, although I came later to it because I really started working in melanoma only 10 years ago. And so many of the initial efforts, obviously, certainly with Jim Allison, like, the portrait of him, his early careers and all these sort of things that needed to happen before he even started thinking about T cells and having the ideas. Obviously, that predated. So I thought it was really well done overall. The couple of things that I actually hadn't known is that how important Jim's role was to identify the T cell receptor in the first place. Everybody has him down as the CTLA4, right? But that's obviously like pretty critical, right? And one could say almost more basic than the CTLA4 molecule, right? Then in terms of how the story was sort of evolved with the CTLA4, I thought it was really well done, sort of to talk to the critical players, the years of work, the sort of struggles in the beginning, the failures that happened with Pfizer, and then the eventual success. I think it was well done. Again, as I said, moving, sort of always having the patient and then Jim, and so obviously there was a lot of like, that's how you make a movie, right? So putting things in parallel that didn't really happen in parallel. But I thought it was overall well done. I felt maybe, so given how critical Jim's work is to the checkpoint field, I felt it was relatively narrow just on the IPI and on the melanoma, when I thought, what was missing was that the PD-1 inhibitors, right, that really kind of changed the field, were basically barely mentioned. And I think that would have been an opportunity to say, like, well, not only did he discover the ipilimumab, but this also was in peril at least, or it may have been fundamental to recognizing that checkpoint inhibition as a concept is important, but maybe CTLA-4 alone is not necessarily the most effective molecule to block, as we now see in the clinic.
So have you had any patients who've had like as remarkable turnaround as Sharon had in the movie?
So I certainly do. I would maybe not necessarily call it so much of a turnaround because, as I mentioned, I really started doing this 10 years ago, and it was really actually exactly at the time when ipilimumab became available on clinical trials. And so while I certainly treated my share of patients with chemotherapy in the early days, even as the first treatment, many also got ipilimumab already at the time. So I didn't have all too many patients that had gotten extensive chemotherapy and sort of conventional treatments and then had the ipilimumab and then had this amazing turnaround. But what I've certainly seen with ipilimumab alone, more now with the combination ipilimumab plus nivolumab, right, where patients are really sick and then they turn around by getting these treatments. I mean, that is like, absolutely, I've seen that, where you quite literally save a patient's life. They know how they know that they have a deadly disease. They can feel it, they can see it. They get told that they have, and at the time it was probably more dramatic because literally the spirit was like, what can we do? And then all of a sudden this new drugs came around. So that was like most dramatic. But certainly seeing a patient who is so sick with a metastatic disease and then you give him this treatment and then like a couple weeks later or a couple months later, like things just get better. And then they actually, I would say most important, they actually usually stay better, right? So it's not like, and we'll probably talk about this more, but it's not a treatment where you continue to give like chemotherapy and then they like continue to come to the treatments and they get sick from the chemotherapy constantly. No, like those patients, they get treated, things get better, and then they essentially, live a normal life after that. And I have a good number of patients in my practice where I can definitely say that. I mean, and you feel kind of honored, right? I mean, because they look at myself as like their savior, right? And I'm like, well, it wasn't really me. It was like the drug, right? But it is like certainly patients look at you like that.
So that is very encouraging. So what Sharon has discussed in the film is also that she felt so much better during treatment with IPI compared to how she felt during the previous treatments with chemotherapy. And so that sounds very promising. And yet the biggest challenge with IPI is the toxicity, right? So that's the biggest challenge. And so was Sharon in the film just fortunate to not have experienced this severe side effects, or are the severe side effects with IPI somewhat of a different type, so that the benefit of therapy really makes the patients feel good during the therapy?
Yeah, so I think to some extent all of it, although I would turn the question around a little bit and say like it's not necessarily the most challenging aspect of IPI, the toxicity. I'd say the most challenging aspect of IPI alone is actually the fact that there is still relatively few patients who respond to it, right? I mean, that's something that I think has to be said. That's IPI alone has a response rate essentially of 15% or so. And when you I can't even remember. I don't think those curves was necessarily shown, but there's these famous survival curves, right? Where ipilimumab basically what it does, it gives this long plateau of survivors that goes out for 10 years and longer. But what you can also see is like initially there's like a huge drop off, right? So that's like a challenge. But of course the toxicity is a challenge. It's certainly true that the toxicity is very different, and it's also very, you could maybe say like upfront toxicity, right? So I mentioned the durability of the responses, and I would almost put it more sort of in this category of like a bone marrow transplant, maybe, or even the high dose IL-2 or TIL therapy that we also now starting to have in melanoma, where patients get really sick in the beginning. They know that, but then they also know, like, well, when they have a response, like that's all, it's all transient and it will go away. The other consideration is also that the toxicity really doesn't affect everyone. So it's like about 30 to 35% of patients who have, as we say, grade 3 or higher toxicity. So there's actually a good number of patients who essentially have no side effects, right? So they go through this treatment and they feel nothing. And to the point sometimes that they feel like, doctor, are you even giving me this, or what are you giving me there? I feel, right? And then there's other, there's no association of the treatment and the actual treatment, so that the infusion and the side effects are decoupled, right? So it's not like the patient would come to the clinic and then feel lousy. There's like, with chemotherapy, there's like this patients dreading the oncology office because they know, like, whenever they go there, like after or at least sort of in the old days, but still to some extent, with ipilimumab, you can be on it for weeks or even months, feel totally fine, and then all of a sudden it hits you with like colitis. So I think every patient is a little bit different. There's certainly, it can be quite toxic when patients have like the really bad, colitis or hepatitis, or there's even bad rashes, but I'd say by and large, it's transient. It can be managed. I would say it does feel different, although I would not necessarily say like it's better if you have like really bad diarrhea but it is probably overall it's probably less sort of fatigue and nausea. So these really like these side effects that really make one miserable, right? So oftentimes it's something that's maybe a little bit more sort of specific, right? So you have, for example, the diarrhea is with the epidemic is like the biggest issue. The diarrhea actually can be controlled very well, usually after a couple of days.
Mm-hmm.
The issue later on is more that they're done on the corticosteroids, and that they can get side effects from those.
Mm-hmm.
But it certainly feels very different from chemo.
Is there anything patients can actually do themselves to help reduce the possibility of side effects, or is there sort of not even any opportunity for that? It's just going to either happen or not happen.
So they really can't do much in terms of preventing it, nor can we as doctors do much about predicting it, unfortunately. I mean, there's definitely some literature where we hope to get there. But right now, I mean, I couldn't think of a kind of a single marker that we like would even, that we would use. I'm really worried, or maybe you shouldn't be so worried, right? For the effects of, say, PD-1 inhibition, we have some markers that we also really don't use necessarily in the clinic, but at least they give us a little bit of a sense. For the toxicity, there isn't really any, and it is extremely random in some way too, right? So there's like, one patient gets the hepatitis, the other one gets the colitis, the next one gets like hypophysitis, different organs. It's usually actually, there's definitely exceptions, but usually it's actually just one organ, right? So it's actually kind of uncommon that somebody would get sort of everything at the same time, where you would, so it seems to be quite sort of, it's a pretty specific process, right? I mean, there's probably some T cell population that's like in that patient that is like really, that was not deleted out in the thymus or something, right? That is really reactive against the colon.
Real basic immunology.
Right.
Yeah.
It probably comes down to that. But in terms of like what a patient can do, I would say it's more, well, be vigilant, right? So what we want them to really call early. We want them to know what could happen so we can intervene early. So that's certainly when things happen, there's an opportunity to intervene early. And there was actually with ipilimumab, there were deaths early with the drug, right? So that patients actually would die from bowel perforation, and that we now know is really quite preventable, right? So it's something like a colitis does not need to lead to bowel perforation. It's purely, if you intervene early, you can essentially prevent it, and that's what the clinical trials show. Like we have sort of the later phase 3 trials that were done with ipi in combination with nivolumab. There were thousands of patients on these trials, and not a single death that was related to the treatments.
So Sharon, the patient in the movie, was really upbeat. So do you think that this feeling good during therapy has some effect on the outcome? So do you think there's some connection between the attitude and the response? And is this maybe something that's unique to immunotherapy?
I think it's unique to any therapy that works for a cancer patient. Right, I think it's this combination. I mean, she was sick for years, right? And and all of a sudden there's this drug that basically doesn't make her sick. And maybe I don't. That wasn't in the movie. It could very well be that she actually did not have any, immune-related toxicities, and they just gave her the drug, and she, things just turned around, right? And so it's the combination of not feeling sick from the cancer anymore, not having symptoms, and a drug that has relatively low toxicity. I think I'm too mechanistic and sort of science-driven a person that I would think that a patient. I think attitude certainly matters, right? And so it's absolutely true that for any cancer treatment, like a good attitude is important and probably helps. Whether it mechanistically or whether it really helps kind of the drug to work, I would, I'm not really aware of data for that. It certainly doesn't hurt to, have a positive attitude, but whether there's a direct relation to response, I'm not so sure.
Okay. So let's turn the conversation to Jim a little bit. There were a lot of adjectives that came up to describe him, right? Fortitude, perseverance, a bloodhound on the trail, thinking outside the box, the, sense of urgency, obsessed with his baby. I don't know what you think, but to me, what I most admire about Jim is that he kind of he thinks with both his head and his heart. So he seems to be driven not only by, what he actually sees, sort of like the things that there are, the real data, but also by, what he can imagine, how things might be. And so he's kind of like both a realist and an artist. Or maybe Willie Nelson would say a musician. So I don't know. What do you think? What do you most admire about Jim, from what you know about him, what you saw in the movie, etc.?
Yeah. So I'd say I don't really know him personally, although I've met. So I've had dinners with others and him, and so I certainly know his, the way he's not shy about talking. How he also kind of mixes his social life and going out and having fun and actually the research. So I know I heard him once talking about, so we were in this bar in Texas, actually where he lives now, right, in Houston, and he was like, 2 years ago I was sitting there with Pam and we wrote a grant and while we were having fun. And so he's definitely blurring the boundaries about between a night out and the science, and I think that's exactly what you just said, Ed, right? So he definitely, it's sort of this rigorous science, and on the other hand is also well, what could be and where should we be, and he's sort of really and sometimes that's that comes across probably as pretty brusque, right? Or not, it can be. Now that he has a Nobel Prize, right? It's oh, right. But a lot of that kind of personality doesn't always rub well, and a lot of people are probably not successful with that.
Mm-hmm.
Right, because you still, science is or being an academic institution is a pretty hierarchical job, and if you have this kind of personality, oftentimes that you're probably just not going to succeed, right? Mm-hmm. So I think he has probably the right mixture of being smart enough to really, people are oh wow, this guy really is super committed. He is in for it, mm-hmm. right? So he's not just somebody who ended up in a lab but could do 3 other things, right? So that is clear. That's pretty clear. I think it became very clear in the movie. This perseverance when these papers came out that CTLA-4 is actually stimulatory, right? And he's well, this can't be right, and right. So that is really, you gotta be really believe what do you think is the data, and not just be dissuaded by somebody else telling you otherwise,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that it's hard to say, like, I mean, obviously there was also Jeff Bluestone who worked on this. So there definitely is a little bit more complicated in terms of like who was on this and like who, deserves recognition, I think, even in the end, right? I mean, there's definitely, as we know, there's some people who feel like, oh, I should have gotten a piece of the pie too. I think the other part is also like it really takes a team, and the movie makes that pretty clear, how he needed partners, and how he found partners and convinced partners at BMS and other places. I mean, obviously the first Medarex, then BMS, that really believed in the idea, and I think it takes probably that kind of personality to find these partners, right?
Right. So it really seems in the movie that these were like two events that really helped with the success, right? So that he found this small biotech company, Medarex, that really was willing to take on the risk and to help bring this to the patient. And then he was also lucky to that Rachel Humphrey was a champion, and that she came to BMS at the right time, and that she was really making a very passionate case for pursuing IPI at BMS at a time where tremelimumab was abundant at Pfizer. So she's really kind of like an unsung hero in the story, like it was shown in the movie, and she really turns the tide here.
Right. I mean, I agree totally with that, and I mean, sort of leads us to the question that we're trying, we've gotten here on this is, why is drug development such a massive tide? Okay, like in this case, it took a Nobel Prize winner to really keep this drug on track at BMS, because I think without him, it would have died sooner there. And so, like, there's so much money at stake. It costs so many hundreds of millions of dollars to develop a drug. And then, it gets to the companies where they have to make all these big dollars and cents decisions all the time. Big pharma companies, they have to worry about their stock price. They have to worry about the investor meeting, their quarterly reports, sort of the general fluctuations of the stock market. And so, why isn't it possible for sort of drug development to be more in the hands of smaller groups where, the complexities of it and the costs are not so large, and they can like keep closer to it because they're dedicated to it, like Jim not wanting to give up his baby. So why are we pushing too much to get drugs into the hands of big pharma? We need to find a way to make it cheaper and easier to develop them, so that attitude, in a sense, about what you're trying to develop can really influence whether it sees the light of day or not.
So that's you could probably have like a week-long seminar about this question, right?
Yeah.
A couple of thoughts. So I feel, number one, so the main driver to me is like the fact that there's a lot of money to be earned, and there's a lot of money that's in the field, right? And I first see that actually as a good thing, right? So it's good to have investors interested. And I actually remember, like, was it Tyler Jackson in the movie, or somebody mentioned that it wasn't actually always like that in oncology, right? So the money was actually in cardiology and other fields where patients actually lived long enough so you could sort of give the drugs to them for years, rather than a cancer patient who had like months to live, right? So that's number one. I think the fact that we really had this revolution where there is just now so many drugs for cancer available is the opportunity for companies to actually make profit, right? And that maybe sound harsh, but it's sort of capitalism at work. I mean, Ute is from Germany. He actually isn't. She is in Germany. I grew up in Germany. I certainly, Germany was leading medicine in the 18th century, right? And now I'd say they're certainly not leading the way in the cancer field. And part of that is actually sort of this, the capitalism that is more. There's just more money that's being pumped into the system, and And that's like, I would say, not a bad thing. The problem though is, and I can see like, with ipilimumab, certainly it was first a small company, right? Medarex was a small company. And I know people who said like, oh, Medarex sold out too early. That may be one of the reasons, right? So maybe Medarex could have found like a partner rather than like being bought up by BMS and then really be exposed to high management decision, right? I mean, Pfizer basically tanks like, okay, we've got the same drug, let's just cut it, right? So that is something that could have easily happened, and that's a real problem for large pharma companies. But at the end of the day, I do think you probably need you need both, but you also need a better system where I completely agree, where you should sort of protect good ideas earlier and not sort of expose that to an investor making a die or live decision like every 3 months seemingly, right? I mean, and we have like lived through that, but with Neon a little bit, right? I mean, that's like so I've certainly personal experience like where as soon as a company basically gets put on the stock market and like then it's very the decision making becomes very different, right? Everybody's just interested in like, oh, when does this drug get FDA approved, and certainly don't have the years that it would take to actually and the money to really figure out how this could work best, and even do like several trials, not just one where everybody looks at it and then kill it, or rather than why would this trust? Let's just do it more like you would do with say mouse experiments in the lab, right? So one experiment doesn't work, well, that doesn't mean like I should give up on the concept. Like let's do like the other 10 mouse experiments too before we like give up on it, right? And that is certainly what's happening with there's definitely many examples in the immunotherapy field now where things are just being thrown by the wayside that may find a better application if they're put in a better context, but it depends on what company owns the drug and what other decision factors are there. But doing that in practice is probably pretty hard, right? I mean, what role should the government or should it not play, right? I mean, in theory, it would be maybe better if there was like a little bit more protection for small companies, or there would be more reward of doing this longer. But it's hard to like, I don't really have a great answer to the problem.
Maybe more small business innovation research grants, bigger money, so that small companies could stay in the business longer, so they get better answers. So.
And it would ultimately be also better for the large companies to actually have the smaller ones, have like more developed products and ideas before they then get involved, right?
Yeah.
But I think a good example of why you need big pharma is actually like the SARS-CoV-2 like vaccines now, right? Where I mean, you basically, in order to do phase 3 trials and really prove that a drug works, you unfortunately need a lot of money. But that is, of course, speaking of like, this could be a seminar, right? I mean, how much money do you need in order to do a phase 3 trial, right? I mean, there could be maybe less regulation. There's certainly, one could think like more visionary, how you could actually make the research less costly,
right?
As well.
Totally agree. Yep.
So in the documentary, you also see that Ipi came in at a time where there was a very low interest in immunotherapy after the failures of interferon and IL-2. So after the approval of Ipi, you already mentioned it, or therapies that target PD-1 or PD-L1 have been developed and quickly approved. Are we now heading to another low in immunotherapy? So what's the current state of immunotherapy? So Edward, maybe do you want to take that question?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to on that. So Ipi was exciting. And I'd say anti-PD-1 was even more exhilarating, as Patrick indicated, because it actually does so much more. But I have to sort of admit, to me, like the sort of like the 2000 clinical trials that immediately got done, throwing everything together with Ipi or anti-PD-1 that they could think of, which didn't really lead to much. That was sort of began to worry a little bit about things we're heading toward a recession maybe. an interest. But, I think since then, or even during then, but now these drugs get approved for many other diseases. They've gotten approved for uses in combination with known existing drugs, be it chemo or et cetera. And so I think all that's buoyed up the interest a lot. And so I think we're not in a trough anymore, and we're in a good place for immunotherapy. I think, as Patrick brought up a little bit, like the success of the whole COVID vaccine, and putting like the pandemic really behind us. I think, are cancer vaccines the next thing on the horizon for cancer immunotherapy, do you think, Patrick? You're pretty close to this. And full disclosure, Patrick and I have worked on personal cancer neoantigen vaccines for about the last 10 years now. So I don't know what your thoughts about that are, Patrick.
So I feel like there's two questions. I wanted to address your first one too, because I do feel that it's really the checkpoint inhibitors that have changed the field, right? And despite the movie and despite Jim Allison's like important role there, I would still say it's the PD-1 inhibition that really have changed the field, because IPI frankly works only in melanoma. IPI alone works only in melanoma. It's not even approved anywhere else, right? So it works very well in combination with PD-1 inhibition, and it's approved in that setting and other cancers. But it's really the PD-1 inhibition that is like I would say it's actually, to some extent, unfortunately, an outlier, right? So 10 years ago, sort of the feeling went from immunotherapy doesn't work to, oh, immunotherapy seems to work, so let's just figure out all the other things. And we know that the immune response can control cancer. We just have to figure out like what else is missing in those patients who don't respond to just the PD-1 alone. Well, it turns out like 7 or 8 years later, most of these drugs actually don't really work, right? Just like before. So when you use like co-stimulatory agonists, or even LAG-3, there was just recently some data that it adds to nivolumab for frontline melanoma treatment, but it's certainly not like the kind of drug comparable to PD-1 inhibition. So I think we are definitely in a field where we have expanded the use of PD-1 inhibition across cancers and in combination therapies, but we really haven't found something else that has an equal benefit, or even combinations that have proven useful, say in like a specific cancer, right? So ideally you would figure out like, well, in gastric cancer there's like this resistance mechanism, so we need this combination, and but that hasn't really happened, I'd say. And so I do feel I'm obviously biased because we have been working on the vaccines for a long time, and I think I've already shared sort of my feeling is like that the concept is still extremely valid to use vaccines either alone or probably in combination, but because they have this unique ability to induce memory T-cell responses that are long-lasting, and there's almost certainly the reason why ipilimumab induces these durable responses is like something along those lines. It somehow like activates T cells that are specific for tumor cells, and then they do their job like for long. They don't need any more help, right? And that is extremely attractive as a concept, and I think it's very valid as a tool. There's challenges, as we have encountered. The personalized vaccines are necessary to take advantage of the neoantigens, because those neoantigens are personal, but it takes a long time to make those vaccines. And then the longer and the more complicated, costly, and time-consuming it is to make these vaccines, the harder it actually is to then compare different things, which you would ideally want to do, right? You would ideally want to say, I got this vaccine, let's compare it with PD-1 inhibition. Let's do different sequencing. Let's do maybe different dosing. Let's add like other co-stimulatory agonists on to that, and all the things that you would do in the laboratory with mice. You would want to like to do with patients, but it's very tricky. And so basically, so far we are very early, where we just have tested a few vaccines. And we have some initial successes, but we certainly need a lot more investment, and we need to try different approaches. And certainly, like that's something we are thinking when Ed is thinking a lot, like, right, how can we make things a little bit simpler, and how can we make these personalized vaccines so that they are targeting the right antigens, but they don't take like months to make, right? Yep. So that's something that's probably
that's to come. So before we close, I understand, Patrick, that you play classical piano. Is that right?
I grew up doing it, and I have a piano in my house, but I play sporadically. Okay. Let's put it that way.
Well, do you wish now that you'd maybe taken up the harmonica?
Harmonica is like it's a good instrument to just like join a band, right?
All right, but there's a lot of cool people in some of those bands.
That's true. That's true. And I actually have to like so they actually have a pianist at that. So you're referring to like the checkpoints probably to some extent too, right? Allison basically has is like and so Patrick Yoo is like he's their pianist, so that spot is already taken. So I could never go on.
Well, Patrick, thank you so much for taking the time today and for being our guest today and for discussing this very fascinating and very inspiring movie with us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. We also want to thank Uncommon Productions for partnering with us and giving our readers free access to the documentary Jim Allison Breakthrough. And we are happy to announce that for those who have not yet seen the movie yet, that it will be available until the end of the month. And you can visit our website at acir.org.
Okay. Thank you.